Which Side Podcast is a proud member of the Which Side Media Collective.
This week's episode is brought to us by the Which Side Media Collective. We are still pre-ordering our new totes with the vegan message on them. You can check them out right now. Get them early and you get them for $7.50.
It's a pretty sweet fucking tote. You know, you get grocery bags at the store and they say thank you all over them. Well, just imagine that, but having it say vegan. So it's vegan in your face, but cute, and, you know, it ends it with a nice, simple message, have a nice day.
And the thank you bags you get at the store are also plastic.
And these are not, because fuck plastic.
These are canvas, and you can reuse them over and over again.
That's right.
Which means you're, like, already better than everyone else because you're saving the environment, and you're vegan, and you're letting everyone know. And you're being preachy. I
love them. They're sweet. Go
$7.50.
Go $7.50. Go get them. They're worth every penny.
WhичSideCollective.org.
This is episode 195.
Yeah, we talked with Josh Harper.
If you don't know who Josh is, you're kind of living in a rock. But he's just a genuine fucking sweetheart. And we tell him at the end, but he's been a huge inspiration to me in my activism from going back into the mid-90s up through today. He's always been a point of inspiration for me. So thank you, Josh. And I just absolutely loved having this conversation with you. I hope you all enjoy it as well. Hey, Jordan, what news and events do we have going on this week?
In Australia, there was a liberation and lockdown. 150 activists converged onto an egg hatchery and shut down the machines and liberated some of the animals.
I love hearing about those things. You don't hear too many actions like that in America anymore, unfortunately. Putting the animals first. I always love it.
If you're going to be in Salt Lake on August 9th, that's Tuesday, you can go and visit the West Valley City Library and join Anarchist Black Cross in their monthly prisoner letter writing night.
I'll be there. I'll give you a high five.
And I'll be there, and I'll give you a low five.
We'll hit you from both ends at once. Ba-bam! And if you're not prepared, that's just like getting hit in the knees and the face at the same time. We'll just take you out. So be prepared. But we'll ask for consent first. So you should be prepared. For the slingshot this week, on August 6th, 1835, there was a bunch of anti-bank riots that started in Baltimore, Maryland. You don't see that shit in America anymore either.
No, no you don't.
But you should. Fuck the banks. If you like these little tidbits of history, I pull them out of the Slingshot Personal Organizer. Go get one yourself at a local info shop or an online info shop. You know, we don't get paid for this. We just really like the shit that they do. So go get your shit organized. I sincerely hope you enjoy this episode.
Yeah, a bit. Haven't seen you since 2001, Jeremy.
Oh, yeah. That's been a long time.
Yeah.
So, how the hell you been?
Well, I guess you could say up and down a little bit. So.
Well, how's your day going so far?
Well, today so far has been nice. I woke up and didn't have to work today, which is always a bonus, and went into Wayward Vegan Cafe and just started the day with way too much food and Yeah, I don't know. It's been a nice one.
That is always the best way. I forget to eat. Like I just realized now I've had one piece of bread today so far.
I don't think I ever forget to eat. I don't think that's something I do.
So right now you're currently working on the Tal conspiracy, which is absolutely amazing. Like, how did you get started in that?
You know, it was when a friend came to me and asked me if I had a full set of Do or Die, and at one point I had a full set of Do or Die along with many other movement publications, but they were all taken when a joint terrorism task force raided my house. So as I started trying to piece together another collection of them, I realized that, you know, people kept telling me like, oh, I lost all of mine in a basement flood, or mine got mold in an attic, or, you know, just things like that. Or people who I had known who had worked on some of these old zines and magazines and such, they just dropped out of the movement altogether, and I couldn't find them. So I started realizing that things that were even fairly modern, things that were published in the late 90s, early 2000s, had already sort of gone through a document extinction. And I wanted to prevent any more of that from happening. And so me and a few other volunteers, we just started tracking stuff down and digitizing it. And as of right now, we have some items that go all the way back to 1945. I'm hoping that we can continue to expand and grow, but right now we're actually on a bit of a hiatus, which I don't know, has been difficult and frustrating, and also a relief after 6 years of tracking this stuff down and digitizing it.
Do you ever want to like expand it beyond just the Amorites focus, and maybe go into other realms of like radicalism?
You know, it's always been a thought, but I think that we'll probably stick with the focus that we have. We receive donations of zines and newspapers and so forth from all over the world. And oftentimes when we get a collection, we'll find things that go outside of the narrowly defined scope of animal liberation. And then we just find other archives to donate those items to. We have had a hard time keeping up on even all the publications that are within our focus. The idea that we would have the labor hours, I suppose, to go into much else. I don't think that's something that we could do right now. That said, there are so many other areas, even of the animal rights movement, that I really wish somebody were archiving. From time to time, I'll think about some old Victorian era pamphlet or newsletters from the early humane groups on the East Coast of the United States. And I know those things exist in special collections libraries where they're accessible to academics, but I would love it if they were accessible to everyone for free. Hopefully someday someone will do that.
That'd be amazing. One of the ones I've always wanted to find, it's more of the welfare aspect of it, but when the Mormons first settled in Salt Lake City, the first thing they printed was newspapers dedicated to how children can better care for animals and like the welfare aspect of caring for animals. It was so just an interesting aspect of it. I've always wanted to actually read them. I know they did it, but I actually haven't read any of them.
Yeah, it's interesting because Mormons weren't the only religion that actually had that sort of humane education slant in the 1800s and early 1900s. As I've started looking into the history of the movement, it seems like there were a lot of faith-based groups at one point that were very interested in human and non-human relations and how we could better treat animals. They hadn't quite gotten to the point of saying that animals were their equal or that they needed to be freed from human subjugation altogether. But it's sort of interesting how we can find that at times a movement towards a better politic between humans and non-humans did come out of faith communities.
So doing this deep dive into the history, which I know most activists probably haven't done, myself included, what's been like the most fascinating aspect of it for you?
Oh my gosh. Well, one aspect that has become really frustrating as I've tried to write a book is that much of our official history is completely fabricated. It was invented to make certain individuals or certain groups look good, look as if they were the hero. But our actual history is a lot more complicated than what's currently been published. And sadly, it's a lot more disappointing. As I began trying to track down groups that had been around in the 1970s and 1980s, when I wanted to sort of understand the more modern element of the animal rights movement, the shift away from welfarism and sort of humane education, more towards direct action, I started to get in touch with organizations like Trans Species Unlimited, and also try to track down older organizations such as, oh my goodness, and now of course I can't remember their name. But anyhow, I wondered, like, where did these groups go? And the sad thing is that for all their vibrancy and the numbers that they were bringing in, other organizations simply saw them as competition for fundraising dollars, for volunteers, and so on. And so these older organizations essentially just shut them down, and sometimes quite viciously. I mean, I actually watched footage on an old beta tape of employees of one organization breaking into the offices of another organization to steal their donor lists. And that story, this was something that had happened to Trans Species Unlimited, who were one of the best organizations of their time in the 1980s. So they went and they confronted the group that had broken into their offices, and they were basically offered this small amount of money to pay for the repairs on things that had been broken during the break-in. And they were asked, please, like, let's not cause any movement disunity. Don't go to the police. They didn't. And then the organization that stole their donor list used it anyway. And eventually stole enough of their operating funds that way that they had to close. And so I don't know. I don't know if in answer to your question, these are really my favorite aspects of our history, but they're definitely the lesser known aspects.
So you said a lot of the history is fabricated. What would be like a piece of fabricated history that we continually repeat, just not knowing that it's fabricated?
The story of Britches is a good one. The raid at UC Riverside. The movement history on that one is pretty darn false. And yeah, I don't know. On the one hand, the part about it that is true, that's wonderful, is that a small monkey named Britches was in fact liberated and did eventually make it to sanctuary. That is the very positive aspect of that story. But the people who had actually taken the risks and who had actually broken into the laboratory that day were not the people who ultimately ended up with Britches or rehoming Britches. There was a very well-known figure from inside the animal rights movement who had heard in advance that this raid was going to be taking place. And so she contacted some of the people in Southern California who she just had suspicion might be involved. And she said, this is an area where I have a lot of expertise. You should bring me out. I'll help handle the media releases and so on. The Raiders had originally planned for the media releases to be handled by Last Chance for Animals. That was who they were going to send their communiques to and who they were going to allow to be the above ground voice for this action. But after the raid, when everyone was back at a safe house, this woman from this other group, she ended up essentially kidnapping Britches and taking one of the vehicles that they had actually, it was supposed to be used in a raid the following night. The following night, UC San Diego was supposed to be raided, but it didn't end up happening because the woman who stole Britches used a vehicle that was needed in that raid. And she traveled across the country, and the next morning, PETA, not LCA, press released the raid. And unfortunately, like many of the raids in the 1980s that we've all, I don't know, my growth in the movement was based on those raids. That was what, as a child, really grabbed me, that there were people who were willing to do these things and that those animals were getting out and being able to live a life of some quality afterwards. But as I've tracked down a number of the people who've actually participated in these things, the sad fact is that in most cases in the raids in the 1980s, afterwards, the animals were euthanized. And in the case of a lot of those California raids, our movement's first big super snitch went on to tell the FBI basically where the bodies were buried. And they were able to confirm that, yes, in fact, many of those animals were euthanized. So we have all these stories that we tell as a matter of cheerleading. But the sad truth is that if we want to see a better animal liberation movement, if we want to see an animal liberation movement that's worthy of the stories we tell of these old 1980s Animal Liberation Front raids, it's something that we're going to have to create, because the history that we've heard more often than not is unfortunately not true.
Sorry, that just kind of left me speechless for a second. Yeah, I didn't know any of that history pretty much with Britches. Because that's like iconic, right?
Yes. Yeah, it was one of the stories that I had really wanted to have as sort of a flagship story. Maybe the opening chapter to a book. During my time in the animal rights movement, I've met a lot of people from the generation before me or the generation before them. And so as I started going around and talking to people and slowly piecing together some of the real story, it was difficult. It was hard to find out that so many of these things that had been so inspiring and so beautiful to me weren't quite what they seemed. That said, though, there were also some figures back then that we had never heard about. There was some history that was suppressed because the people who were responsible for that history didn't fit into the image at the time of what a good activist should be, which at the time was pretty much white and heterosexual. And so one of the things that I'm hoping to do with the book now is to tell the story of one of these forgotten figures. It's the story of a gay man who went vegan in the 1960s, who got into punk music in the 1970s and started spreading the animal liberation message that way as he was crisscrossing venues throughout the United States. In the 1980s, he was sabotaging equipment. He was raiding labs. He was fighting the police in the streets of San Francisco during the AIDS epidemic. He's one of the figures in the movement that I really wish I had known about when I first became involved. And he's somebody who I think could give representation to a whole cross-section of animal liberationists who previously haven't seen themselves written into our movement's history as heroes. And so there are some positives, and those positives are what I'm now hoping to follow up on in a book eventually, which have either of you tried to write a book before, man? Because that shit is hard. I can't really say that I recommend it, but it is something I hope to one day accomplish.
Yeah, every author we've ever talked to says that it's the most daunting task they've ever, taken up.
It's fucked up is how I would describe it. I don't know. I mean, at one point I wrote for nearly 2 years, but I'm really careful because I know that as a participant in the movement, people are going to be very careful about bias, and they're going to worry about the historiography of what I write. They're going to be curious if this is cheerleading, if this is fabrication, is this something that I'm saying to make the movement look better? So I really wanted to follow everything up. I wanted to get as many sources of confirmation on people's stories as I could, but that's difficult in an underground movement, in a movement that often hid who was participating, hid precisely what they were doing. But as I started to get more information, as more people started agreeing to interviews, as I started getting more primary source documents and obtaining things through the Freedom of Information Act, the more I started figuring out that a lot of what I was being told was just simply not true. And at one point, over 2 years into writing the book, I had to scrap the whole thing and start over. And so, yeah, it's challenging and awful. And I don't know. Hopefully someday, though, I will manage to actually produce something that gives a more accurate image of what our history is, and hopefully also some suggestions on how we can improve going forward.
What you brought up has been a personal challenge for myself in that everything that happens inside our movement gets ultra criticized, and there's from my perspective, almost no seeming understanding of nuance.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like no matter what anyone does, someone's going to try to tear him down.
Yeah, I would say that there's some accuracy to that. I mean, there's definitely sections of the movement that their criticism is almost obstructionist in form. Its intention is not to help us progress or grow or to think more critically about the direction that we're moving. Its purpose is to hammer the recipient or the target and to obstruct them from doing anything further. Back in the 1990s, a good example of that might have been somebody like Merritt Clifton, who is the publisher of Animal People, a publication that's funny because it's the only time that Merritt ever put animals before people. But he constantly was going after movement militants and trying to stop the growth of the militant grassroots here in the United States. And I see that continuing to this day. So on the one hand, there is some really some basically defamation parading as criticism that happens sometimes. On the other hand, though, what you mentioned about nuance, there are times that I wish our movement was just a little bit more critical. I wish that we could really look at what is the plan. I wish we could look at how do we expect in the world that we have right now, and this reality that we are currently living in, how do we get from point A to point B? And there don't seem to be a lot of people really asking that question or criticizing the current strategies in order that they might find something better. It's sort of a mixed bag as that criticism thing goes.
So what is that answer? So like you take people who want to be able to have those discussions, but it seems they're few and far apart. And when you try to have those discussions, you almost get broken apart by being called an obstructionist or being, trying to pick apart the movement.
If I had the answer, it's something I think I would have already implemented. I don't really know. I've been involved in some animal rights communities that developed sort of organically, and where we have managed to have very respectful discourse. And we've been able to challenge each other's ideas while also actually encouraging everyone in the group to action. SHAC was actually a pretty good example of that. Compared to other organizations that I'd been a member of, like, say, Liberation Collective or Sea Defense Alliance or something like that, there was a lot more discussion of tactics. There was a lot more discussion of what it was going to take to get from point A to point B. At least early on, there was.
Do you
like
think that,
so?
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, do you think that might have to do with that SHAC was pretty laser focused inside of their mission statement, where other organizations are kind of broad in their mission statement, right?
Right. I do see that as definitely being a part of it. I think also, though, back then we had the benefit of, that flash of activity that had occurred from the early 1990s up until the late 90s. A lot of us had been able to really hone our skills within the little grassroots groups that were in every major city in the United States at that time. We had already had a chance to sort of organize, to figure out what worked, what didn't work. And I remember very early on us pointing out that contentious debate could really tear a group apart. And so, within the mission statement, oftentimes, people who couldn't come to an agreement with each other about how to progress would each find a way to progress separate from each other. It's like, well, perhaps you're not into home demonstrations, and so here's all these other tactics that you can use. And instead of criticizing the people who are using home demonstrations, just go and do those things. And, it gave everyone sort of room to move. But at times, it also meant that we became a little acritical, or perhaps a little too forgiving of the direction that some of the more extreme tactics were going.
It's one of those things where I personally try to have that mantra with inside the movement, where I don't want to be super critical of what individual activists are choosing to do, but at the same time wanting to have that discussion on whether these tactics are actually going to help achieve the end goal. So without criticizing the individual actions, have the larger tactic discussion. Yeah,
it's hard.
Yeah, and I was going to say, one of the things that a speech that you gave recently that made me really think about it was a speech. I can't remember the title of it, but you talked about the militant labeling of the ALF and pretty much how that is kind of counterproductive. And it really made me take pause and really think about it, because it was an aspect that I'd never considered before, and I started seeing it in a lot of other ways ever since listening to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. A few years ago, I became familiar with the concept of toxic masculinity. And I started seeing all the ways that it was being reproduced in animal rights movement literature. The whole aesthetic and rhetoric of the Animal Liberation Front really was really pushing this toxic masculinity. Everything was about power. Everything was about strength. All of the rhetoric when you read it could have been George Bush writing it. It was all this, you're with us or you're against us. Mm-hmm. There was all this stuff about cowardice and courage and all of these things that sometimes left the animal out of the equation altogether and ignored the fact that the reason why we're taking these actions is something that actually comes from a much softer place in our hearts. I started to wonder about all the people who might have otherwise participated in direct action, who might have actually gone out and physically saved animals' lives if they had been able to better see themselves within the narrative of direct action. And so over time, I really did come to understand the Animal Liberation Front's rhetoric and aesthetic choices as having no real purpose. They don't benefit us. They don't benefit non-humans. In fact, in most ways, they're detrimental to us. You can see the ways in which our opposition loves to reproduce the images of angry young men in masks. When groups like Center for Consumer Freedom were buying full-page ads in the New York Times, what did they choose to highlight from our movement? They didn't choose to highlight the images of chickens or cats or dogs or other animals being taken out of labs. They certainly didn't want to show what their lives looked like post-liberation or prior to liberation. What they wanted to show was angry young men holding bolt cutters and holding, sledgehammers. And that was telling to me. So I love what the Animal Liberation Front has done for the most part throughout its history. The actions themselves aren't something that I really question, but I think that we could amplify the power of those actions and the number of people doing them if we were more careful about the way that we spoke and the way that we presented ourselves. Ultimately, I think that it would be best if we did not present ourselves at all. I think it would be great if the human activists disappeared from the picture and what people were seeing were the lives that are being saved and what sort of misery those lives were being lived in prior to liberation and what sort of freedom they get to live in post-liberation. I think personally that would encourage more action, and it would make more people sympathetic to the raiding of labs and fur farms and other places of animal abuse.
What was really interesting to me about that was that self-reflection it made me take, because in the late 90s, going to like hardcore shows and getting copies of like No Compromise, that's what pushed me from being just a vegan to actually wanting to be an activist, right? And actually, getting out there and being a grassroots activist instead of just listening to music. Was that rhetoric and was that imagery. And so it just made me like really have that self-reflection aspect of like, where was I at that point? Right.
Right. I think it's something that a lot of us go through. I mean, when you grow up enculturated as a male in the United States, every advertisement, every television show, every billboard, everything about our culture is doing its utmost to shape us into this image of toxic masculinity, to make us repress the parts of ourselves that are soft, the parts of ourselves that are compassionate, and we do that in favor of competition, aggression, things like that. So these are learned patterns of behavior. So of course those things are going to grab young men. It's what they're designed to do, I mean, if you listen to some of the speeches I was making when I was 21, 22, 23 years old, that shit's embarrassing, man. And it reads like hardcore lyrics, because at that time I wasn't just trying to prove to the movement my dedication. I was trying to prove my masculinity. Mm-hmm. Being able to let go of that and realizing that it's not something I have to live up to. It's not something I have to evoke. It's not something I have to appeal to in others in order to be listened to. It's such a relief. And I I've noticed that, at times it's given me access to a broader audience that I don't think would be paying much attention to me if I was still saying like, the hammer of vegan justice falls and shit like that. So,
but it would be a good song, right?
It would be a good song. Culture should do that shit, man. Get back together, throw that on wax. I'd listen to it.
So is that like where your origins of like activism came from? Is it from like the punk hardcore scene, or if not, what were your origins?
It's sort of hard to say. I first became vegetarian when I was 15 years old. And I do think that coincided with the time period that I first started listening to hardcore and punk music. I know I got my first Minor Threat cassette right before I turned 15. So when I was 14 years old. I don't think that it had much influence on my becoming vegetarian or later becoming vegan, but it did cause me to look outside of the politics that I was, given access to in Eugene, Oregon, which on the one hand was this very pacifist, hippie, let's pretend politic. And then on the other hand, you had all the people from the extraction industries around there, loggers and people involved in mining and ranching and things like that. The back and forth battles that I was reading in the op-ed pages of our newspaper made it seem like there weren't a whole lot of options available. The scope of things being discussed was so limited, and typically it was just about small scale economics. And then I started listening to punk music, and all of a sudden I was thinking about race and class. I was thinking about gender and sexual preference. I was thinking about the state and whether we need one. And so I do think punk and hardcore ended up eventually influencing the direction that I went, but I don't think that they were necessarily the origin of my political shift.
So if that not the origin, what would be the origin?
I think what was really the origin for me was realizing, I think I was probably about 12 or 13 years old when I couldn't deny anymore that I had a same gender attraction, that there were men that I was interested in. And that happened to be right about the same time that this organization called the Oregon Christian Alliance was forming in my home state. I started seeing them out on the streets doing protests, and there was a part of me that realized that I was one of the people that they were protesting. I was one of the people whose rights and freedoms they were hoping to suppress. And so when I was about 15 years old, I joined a group that had formed to counter the OCA that was called Coalition for Human Dignity. We ended up eventually having a lot of problems with neo-Nazis who were flooding into the state. They saw the intolerance of the Oregon Christian Alliance as a point that they could rally around and organize around. It was a point of political entryism for them. And so it was in those days of, being in fistfights with skinheads in the streets of Eugene, of having police fire pepper spray and rubber bullets at us so that, Nazi rallies could continue. Those were the days that I started to really see the possibilities and to start to really understand that politics were so much bigger and could be so much more participatory than what I had previously been told. And so, I think it was coming to terms with, my own queerness and those early days of actually having to struggle against an anti-gay movement that that started to radicalize me. This is also at the same time that, Gulf War I was going on, Bush Sr. was in office. So the people that I was meeting who were part of Coalition for Human Dignity were also out fighting against the war. I started going to some of these anti-war rallies and meeting young anarchists there. And I remember overhearing some of them doubting the worth of civil disobedience. They were like, the cops love to beat you up and arrest you. That's what they exist for. That's what they're there for. Why voluntarily do that? And then I remember a group of them leaving one of the main demonstrations one time and breaking bank windows that belonged to a bank that was supporting the war effort. And that was mind-blowing to me. The fact that they were taking things into their own hands at the time, I remember being like, this is terrible. This is, but within a few days, I had become sympathetic to it. And from there, I started reading Alexander Berkman, Emma Goldman, and the other classical anarchists. And that's when I knew I'd found my people and found my purpose.
So for you, anarchism led into veganism?
It's so hard to say, one thing definitely kind of props up another, but my thoughts were advancing along so many lines at once, and I was finding so many intersections, at the time that it's sort of hard to say, like, what led to what. Anarchism was something that I think I had first become curious about, when I was 13 years old. And it was just because there was a guy who was on the bus to my school every day who had a lot of really cool shirts and patches. and yeah, he always, had these little things about anarchism on him. And, but I think it wasn't for a few more years that I started to really understand what they meant. I'm not giving you any kind of answer at all here, am I? I'm just rambling at this point. I should just stop. I'm sorry.
Well, what's funny is that Jeremy and I both, I think we were both claiming anarchism before we were ever
before I knew what it was.
Exactly.
Like really, to be honest, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And I was just going to say, I was going to ask you, as I get older, I feel like my anarchist tendencies, maybe I'm just becoming more jaded, but maybe I'm questioning them a lot more than I used to as a youth. Do you feel yourself doing the same thing?
Oh, yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I was younger, it was so easy to be ideological about things, and it was great because it prevented me from having to actually think. It was already done for me. Mm-hmm. All this stuff was written out in books, and so whether you were siding with Bookchin or Zerzan, Bob Black or whoever, already there were these ready-to-wear pre-made politics that you could just jump into. And, when I was much younger, I identified as a green anarchist. There's a part of me that still does, that still feels that. But I had an answer for everything, and it was impenetrable, the ideology. Nothing could get past it, I knew precisely how I saw the world and what was good and what was evil. But as I got older, the complexities came more into view, and you have certain life experiences that the ideology alone can't answer. And so it's been very difficult. I miss certainty, Mm-hmm. It was wonderful being younger and being able to talk with absolute confidence about everything. There was something about that was really encouraging and really safe. But that said, as I've gotten older and left that behind a little bit and had to start thinking, had to start answering questions for myself, and move beyond the ideology a little bit, it's difficult, it's messy, I make mistakes, but I think I've also become a fair bit more intelligent doing that. And I think that it's made me a lot more, I guess, sympathetic to people who might not otherwise have wanted to listen to me, because I had just straight up dogmatism spewing from my mouth, you know. The fact that I can stop and consider things now, the fact that not everything has to fit into some rigid ideology, I think I hope has made me easier to talk to.
Do you find yourself aligning with any subsect now of anarchism? I found as I've gotten older, I went from being, you know, mainly a green anarchist to like an anarcho-syndicalist, and now I'm just like, well, I know I'm an anarchist, but I really don't fucking know anything else.
You're a nihilist.
I'm an anarcho-pessimist now. I don't know. I definitely am not very enamored of like the trend towards like anarchy de jure, where every few years there's some new political line and everyone's expected to know it and repeat it. Mm-hmm. I mean, a while ago it was illegalism, and then, you know, that became insurrectionary anarchism, which as far as I can tell is an attempt to like build a political ideology around like spray paint and broken windows or something. And I don't know, man. I have a hard time making sense of it. Maybe I'm just an old man, but these new trends in anarchism that come up, they wouldn't have grabbed me as a young person. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't have spoken to the part of me that wanted to be freer, and that wanted to see the people around me be freer. Nowadays, individualism has infected it so much that I think anarchists have forgotten that we can have a politic that both respects the collective and the individual. We can have a politic that questions, you know, how do we want to live together as a society, and that a state does not have to be the answer to that. And of course, nowadays with the nihilist thinking, it's not something I can really much relate to. So yeah, I'm trying not to become a pedantic old man. I'm trying not to be like the social ecologists of my youth, who just repudiated anything that young people were saying. But there are moments where I'm like, oh, fuck, I'm one of those guys now. I can't relate to the kids anymore.
Do you ever yell at people, say, get off my lawn?
No, not yet. But I'm only 41. There's still time.
There's still time.
Well, I was thinking about back when you said that certain people will say things like, if you're not with us, you're against us, and how that applied to me when I came out of prison, realizing like I was too nervous to go to protests, and like I think PTSD was like a serious thing. And so that's when I started to realize when I said that shit, it's not really cool.
Yeah, it's a weird thing, man. That whole post-prison thing is tough. You get out and people want to place you on some sort of pedestal. You know, they want to imagine you as a hero now rather than a human being. But you get out and you are traumatized. At least most of us are, I think, who go through that experience. And so it's difficult. There's all these expectations that are placed upon you. People want you to be front and center at demonstrations. They want you to be the guy who's up front marching and the one who's issuing the most extreme rhetoric or something. And man, I got out and I just, I wanted every day not to be a nightmare anymore. I wanted to find a way to relax and rediscover some kind of beauty in my life. I wanted to reestablish the relationships I'd had with people that had sort of fallen apart during the 3 years that I was away. And yeah, dealing with the judgment of kids who hadn't been alive as long as I had been vegan. You know, that was painful, and it still is painful. I still deal with that sort of criticism about my level of contribution these days. And on the one hand, I get it. People want to, they want everyone to be chipping in. They want everyone to be sort of doing their utmost to progress this movement. But on the other hand, we have to understand that different people have different limitations. And, being a prisoner, I mean, that's something that can take a while to heal from. So, yeah, that's my call for understanding there.
I was definitely one of those dumb 18, 19-year-old kids where I was yelling, at the older generation that had been vegan longer than I'd been alive, and like, why aren't you showing up to protest? Like, there's no fucking excuse. And now I find myself in my, mid to late 30s, and I'm like, oh, now I get it. Like,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now you've got bills to pay.
Yeah. I have real responsibilities.
Yeah, it's hard. I don't know. I remember the part of me that was yelling those things, and I know where it was coming from, and I was sincere. I really wanted to see people, giving their all. I wanted everyone to be making the sacrifices that I saw it as so easy to make. What I didn't realize at that time, though, was that, as like a white, able-bodied male living in North America, the possibilities for me were it was maybe a little bit easier to get arrested every weekend. It was maybe a little bit easier to live off of, $200 a month and sleep in a closet and crisscross the country on trains going to demonstrations. But when you have people who have children, when you have people who, come from a community that's classically repressed by the police, it's like, that's an awful lot to demand of them. We also have to realize, though, that making those demands has never once in our history led to what we hope for it to. Every generation of animal rights kids has the people front and center screaming, like, we all need to do this now, revolution now, like, where the fuck are you? And, they've never once succeeded. Not one grouping of them in one generation. Mostly what they've succeeded in doing is just alienating those around them, and actually they accomplish less participation that way. So that's something I wish I could reach kids about, meeting people where they're at, respecting the limits of their capabilities, and finding a place for them within the movement regardless. I don't know. It's a hard one to convince kids about.
It's interesting because, I totally see the need for that, but I know myself at that time would have not listened.
Nope. and I mean, I remember people trying to talk to me about it. Actually, I remember Jonathan Paul at one point taking me aside, and he was like, man, he's like, one of two things is going to happen. He's like, you're either going to push yourself too far and you're going to burn out, and you're not going to be able to take it anymore because you've taken on too much responsibility. He's like, or you're going to draw so much attention to yourself that you're, going to end up in prison. And I guess he was right. Shit. So, but at the time I did, I saw it as a lapse in his resolve, as a lapse in his revolutionary spirit. And it's shameful. I mean, I say that now, and here the guy is, he's in his 50s. He's still involved. He's still out there doing things. I wish when I was younger, I had the wherewithal to listen to him.
Do you ever find yourself looking back and romanticizing your history a little bit?
Oh yeah. It's easier than being honest about it, isn't it? I there'll be times that, I'll be telling people about how awesome we all were in 1996. And that leaves out the parts where, I was dressing up as a pig at PETA rallies while people with rubber, cleavers chased after me. And all the embarrassing street theater stuff we used to do. Oh God, the time period where like Craig and LJ and I were all super into Gandhi in Portland. I mean, that shit's embarrassing. But yeah, it's easy to retell it to people now as like, you know, we were all like super radicals and we were, you know, breaking down the walls of the system day after day. You know, it's nice to allow myself a little fantasy sometimes, though.
What's been your hardest lesson to learn in activism so far?
They've all been so hard to learn. I'd say though, the hardest one for me was don't talk about prison unless you've been there. You know, I'd done a lot of prison support, and a lot of my friends had done time at one point or another. And, you know, I read a lot of anarchist Black Cross literature. Come on, like this was something I had a good understanding of. And so it's something I used to speak about like I was some type of authority on it. And then I went to prison and realized that I was completely full of shit. And so, yeah, sometimes I think it takes suffering consequences to actually understand consequences. I remember when I got out and I was seeing, God, I'm going to get kind of shit talky here. But I saw people like Camille Hankins and Jerry Vlasic saying all this stuff about what prison was like and why people shouldn't fear it. And I was like, how would either of you know? You know? And so that was a difficult one. You know, it was something that actually took suffering consequences. It took actually being sentenced to prison to understand. But now that I do understand it and I see the younger generation doing the same thing, it's difficult. It's hard not to be infuriated and come off as the angry old guy. But it is something that here and there I find myself jumping into conversations and having to correct.
From your perspective, what is the best way we as a community can help support current prisoners and then also post-prisoner release?
I'd say the best way to support current prisoners is to write to them and to ask what they most need. Different people are in different institutions. Each institution is a little bit different. Different people have different personalities, and there are going to be different aspects of incarceration that affect them the most. So that's something that we need to become more collaborative about. You know, we need to understand that there is no silver bullet for prisoner support, that each case is going to be unique and individual, and we need to rise to that challenge. As far as post-prison support, though, there is this thing called post-incarceration syndrome. And it means that a lot of us getting out are having a very difficult time with mental health. We could even be having a difficult time in social situations, dealing with the way that people use space in the outside world versus behind bars. I mean, being on buses was horrible for me when I got out. And there was no support left. I mean, as soon as I was released, it was like, welcome back, buddy. And that was it. So as a movement, we need to become better trained. And we need to probably get some people involved who have a certain specialization of skills, people who are social workers. And we need to start helping our prisoners after they're released to navigate getting insurance, to finding psychiatric help. We need to have somebody there who can give people advice on, getting past the institutionalization that happens behind bars. Those are all areas of prisoner support that I think we have terribly neglected, and I can, vouch for the negative impact that they've had on me personally.
I'm one of those ones that is definitely guilty of always saying that the need for supporting prisoners, the need for writing prisoners, and then in my own personal life, the lack of actually following through on that. And it's one thing that luckily I'm trying to combat myself, because I recognize the importance of it, and maybe me calling myself out, more and more, it will help me push myself into better supporting, because I understand it, but it's fucking hard sometimes. Just the whole situation.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
I haven't written a letter to a prisoner since I've gotten out of prison, and it's because doing it makes me have to think about it. But that said, everyone's got their limitations. Everyone has sort of their strengths and their weaknesses. And so when I'm unable to personally write, I can still send magazines. That's something that I've realized is really simple to do. I visit people's support web pages. I see what it is that they are into reading. And it's real simple to just go online, take out your debit card, and sign somebody up for a year of a publication that they're going to enjoy. So that's something that can be done. There is a real need to have literature distributed that, has prisoners' addresses, that talks about how to write to a prisoner, that talks about, what to say and why support is necessary. And that's something that, we can all do. Not everybody at the end of the day, I think, is going to sit down and write, but we have to be sure that enough people are. And then there's all the other aspects of prisoner support that are needed as well. And so there's a place for all of us. I don't write letters anymore. I'm hoping that someday I'm comfortable doing so again. But that said, I try to make sure that I'm always sending something. I'm always doing something. I'm always promoting it or letting people know that this is a necessity, and it's part of what's going to ultimately make our movement successful.
Well, I just want to let you know, without trying to put you on too much of a pedestal, you've always been an inspiration to me in my activism, and you continue to do so. So thank you very much.
That's very sweet. Thank you.
And I also, I'll say that when I was writing you and then I went in and you wrote my parents, that meant a lot to me.
I actually remember that. Yeah. I remember getting a response from your mom, if I remember correctly.
I was with his parents when they were there and going through that, and it really meant a lot to their parent, like to his mom and dad, because it showed like real support, because they were still in that state of not understanding, of why everything was happening, and it really helped them understand that this is what he was going through is greater than just himself, unfortunately.
Wow. Well, I'm glad that I was able to do that. It means a lot to hear that. Thank you.
No, thank you. Seriously. How can people get in contact with you and follow your current work that you're doing?
Oh man, the current work that I'm doing is just a 9-to-5 job, and it sucks. But I would say to keep an eye on the TalonConspiracy.com. Like I mentioned earlier, it is currently on hiatus, but my hope is to come back within the next 6 months. And what I would really like to do when we relaunch is to relaunch with a full set of Archangel. So that's sort of the current project. Other than that, though, I'm accessible. I'm out there on the internet. I'm on Instagram and Twitter and all that. I can be searched for that way. And yeah, I love hearing from people, and I love, answering what questions I can about this movement's history or what few tactical insights I've managed to gain. So yeah, if folks want to find me out there on the internet, I would love to hear from them.
Well, we end every episode saying "fuck, shit, damn." Would you mind saying it for us this week?
I'd be happy to. Swearing is one of the few things in life that brings me joy. So yeah, fuck, shit, damn.
This week you heard.
Lower the Heavens by the Donkeys.
All right, now you're listening to.
Bon Tempi Latin by Holy Fuck.
You know, every week we say go rate and review us on iTunes. And this is no different. Go rate and review us on iTunes. And, you know, if you give us a nice little review, we'll read it out loud for you. But you don't just have to do iTunes. You can do any place that has rating reviews that you get your podcast from. Any podcast aggregate system.
Google Play Music or Stitcher or even YouTube.
Yeah, we are now loading all of our videos. Well, they're videos there, but all of our episodes as videos onto YouTube. The entire back catalog is there. So go check them out. Go like them there.
Give us a little bit to get it all sorted if it's confusing.
It is confusing. It's a little confusing. But yeah, we're making it work. Just for you all.
If you're not yet our friend, you should be our friend on social media. We post things on social media that we don't talk about on the show every day. So be our friend, like us, follow us. And if you do, and you use hashtag Jordan's Cooler Than Jeremy, you'll get a prize.
I mean, it's just the truth.
It's the truth. Only one.
Only one truth.
Only one truth.
I am not alone. Because you're with me right now. Yeah.
I'm not doing this.
No hardcore lyrics?
No. Fuck shit down.
Fuck shit down.
Whichside Podcast is hosted and produced by Jordan Halliday and Jeremy Parkin of the Whichside Media Collective, with web design by Jordan Halliday and sound design by Jeremy Parkin. Booking by Mari Halliday. Theme music by Commandantes. Go to whichsidecollective.org to check out the other shows in the collective. As always, fuck shit damn.